We'll also take notes on the session today and share those. We have took notes last week also. So the summary of the feedback we received will also be shared with you once we have it pulled together.
Great. Well, thanks for the intro, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Andrew Plunkett. I'm a project lead in the Environment and Climate Division on the Net Zero team, our small but mighty team that oversees the development and implementation of the TransformTO Net Zero strategy. We have a few other staff members here. Maybe we won't introduce everyone right at the outset, but we can later on when we get into questions possibly. But for starters, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Kim, who's going to do our acknowledgements.
Thank you, Andrew.
If I can advance the slide as well. Hang on, there we go.
So the City of Toronto acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And we'll also deliver an African ancestral acknowledgement. Though I am not a person of African descent, I am committed to continually acting in support of and in solidarity with Black communities seeking freedom and reparative justice in light of the history and ongoing legacy of slavery that continues to impact Black communities in Canada. As a part of this commitment, I would also like to acknowledge that not all people came to these lands as migrants and settlers. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. In support of the City of Toronto's ongoing efforts to confront anti-Black racism, I pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent.
Thanks, Kim.
Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks. So let's jump into the presentation. As Nicole mentioned, we'll have about 20 minutes of presentation and we'll have lots of time for some questions. Quick outline, we're going to go through a little bit about what climate change looks like in Toronto. You all already know this, I'm sure, but we can talk a bit about that. I'll tell you a little bit about TransformTO, the backgrounds and goals and critical steps and principles, where we've come over the years with TransformTO, where we're currently at, the path to net zero, and then finally where we're heading, so the net zero action plan that is under development and this public consultation process and ways to get involved. And again, we'll have some time for Q&A. So what does climate change look like in Toronto? I mean, again, you all know this, but I mean, this is a pretty unsettling photo of the Toronto Islands underwater. All of these photos that you're about to see are basically taken over the last 5 to 6 to 7 years. So this isn't necessarily new, but these changes have been happening in recent times. This is the DVP flooded this summer. This is a map of heat wave from last summer, daily humidex maximums in the low 40s. And this is from, I think also this, sorry, I can't see my little box either, this summer or last summer, and this is smoke from, this is last summer, smoke from wildfires in the city impacting our air quality. So these are just some examples of climate change impacting our city on a fairly regular basis now. And these examples are borne out in the statistics that we have on climate impacts that we get from the TRCA. So, for example, daily temperature maximums, if we look back at the beginning of this century, a typical annual maximum temperature in Toronto would be about 37 degrees. But the projections are showing that later, by mid-century, we're looking at 44-degree high temps in Toronto. Hot days above 30 degrees, we're looking at a total number previously of only about 20. Now we're trending towards 66 hot days per year. Heat waves are increasing and daily rainfall maximums are increasing. And again, we saw that this summer when the DVP flooded, I think it was 3 times, and I know other people had personal experiences with that as well, with basement flooding, etc. So we're seeing a lot of, we're seeing more extreme weather, but we're also seeing it more frequently. And that's a very significant challenge for those of us in the city. So we'll talk a little bit about our climate strategy and its development as well. So you may know that the original version of TransformTO was approved by Toronto City Council in 2017. And in 2019, Council declared a climate emergency. And at that time, they directed staff to recalibrate the strategy and find a way to reach net zero emissions community-wide by 2050 or sooner. So our team was part of many people within the city and many divisions working on that, obviously, but we were stewarding this process, developing what's now called the TransformTO net zero strategy. There was a significant amount of stakeholder and public engagement and technical modeling that went into the strategy. It was approved by City Council in December 2021. And as you may know, it has a long-term goal of net zero emissions by 2040. So it's one of the more ambitious targets for a municipality in North America. And there's an interim target of a 65% reduction in emissions by 2030. So we'll talk about a bit about that in a moment and where we're on that path. But you will note in the strategy, the 2030 target and the 2030 sort of sector goals were quite deliberate, because we're trying to orient people to a more immediate challenge, right? When you talk about 2040 and 2050, it doesn't really resonate with people that it's really important necessarily, or that it can wait, but we know that it can't wait. Quickly, what are net zero emissions? I mean, basically, it's where we've stopped emitting greenhouse gases from how we live, work, and travel to get emissions as close to zero as possible. We know that we can't get to absolute zero. There will be some remaining emissions, sometimes called fugitive emissions. And this would be through things like landfill, like methane gas, landfill that's already in the ground and we can't do anything about, possibly some industrial processes that can't be converted, or buildings, unique buildings that can't be converted, for example. So any remaining emissions would then be offset by an equivalent amount of carbon removals. And what is the action plan? So the action plan is obviously part of the strategy. The strategy is longer term, out to 2040, but it's important to have shorter term action plans within the strategy that help us get there and get on that path. The existing action plan was 2022 to 2025, so we're entering the final year of that. It includes a set of 30 key actions in 7 sectors, so it's quite detailed. You can find it on our website. And we're currently developing the next action plan, which is what this consultation process is all about, and it will be for 2026 to 2030. We are doing another round of technical modeling, so that basically models the different actions and cost effectiveness of different actions on getting to net zero. And we're doing also internal and external consultations. So we do quite a bit of engagement with our other divisions and agencies and corporations, key stakeholders, and obviously public engagement as well. And we're in the middle of that process right now. In the strategy, you'll see 4 critical steps to net zero. Demonstrate carbon accountability locally and globally by establishing a carbon budget, which is now, we do now have an internal carbon budget at the city. Accelerating a rapid and significant reduction in fossil natural gas in buildings. Increasing access to low carbon transportation options, so that would be active transportation, transit, and EVs, and increasing local renewable energy generation. The strategy also has our 2030 sector-based goals on new buildings designed to net zero GHG emissions and decreasing emissions from existing buildings. And we have people on the call here from both of our new buildings and existing buildings teams. If there are questions, 50% of energy coming from renewable or low carbon sources, 20% of industrial floor area connected to low carbon thermal energy, 30% of registered vehicles being electric, 75% of trips under 5K, either active or transit, and 70% of residential waste diverted from landfill. The strategy also has a number of guiding principles, and you'll notice from this list that these are quite heavily equity focused by design: advance social equity, protect low-income residents, affordability, enhance the local economy, create good quality local jobs, improve public health, and contribute to poverty reduction and create resilient communities. So The important point here is that the climate strategy is meant to support a number of other goals that the city has in social equity, and it's also not meant to exacerbate any issues that people might be facing with affordability, for example, or inequities. So it's really important that as we do climate action, that we're also keeping all of these things in mind and really focusing on all of the city's equity-based goals. And this slide just shows some of the opportunities as well. So, again, like climate action doesn't need to exist in a vacuum. When you do climate action, it also can have other benefits. So, for example, when you make a building more energy efficient, you reduce energy costs as well. You reduce the bills, and you can make it more, affordable. Although, of course, it does, there are investments needed to do that work. The strategy is also meant to focus on public health, and healthy natural environments, and boosting the local economy and local jobs. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity on the economic side for all of the work that needs to happen in home retrofits and tech, green tech, battery tech, green transportation, et cetera. So again, it's not, climate action is, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there are definitely co-benefits to the work involved in TransformTO. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the programs, so like sort of, you're probably aware of a number of these things, but some of the things that are happening within the TransformTO Net Zero strategy. So for homes and buildings, we have another number of programs like the Better Buildings Partnership and Better Homes, Eco Roof Incentive, Home Energy Loan Program, retrofit loans, the Toronto Green Standard, Solar TO, and the Green Will Initiative. So these are buildings programs aimed to make buildings more efficient and also to fuel switch away from natural gas. There's a number of transportation programs for low carbon transportation. Obviously, we have the cycling network plan, bike share, rapid TO, which is enhancements to typically to bus rapid transit in the city, smart commute programs, anti-idling, EV strategy and public EV charging. And there are some EV incentives, not from our level of government nor from the province, but you can get them from the federal government. And the city's been greening our fleet, so that's fleet vehicles and transit vehicles, which are being electrified. There's a number of waste programs as well that you're probably familiar with, the Waste Wizard, the Long-Term Waste Strategy, Community Environment Days, Waste Reduction Community Grants, and also a number of engagement programs that are run mostly through the outreach engagement program in our division, Clean Toronto Together, Live Green Volunteers, Neighborhood Climate Action Champions, the Women for Climate Program, and Climate Action Grants, among other programs. You can find more information on all of this on the TransformTO website, or also the Live Green website is probably the best landing place for all of these resources. And we'll have some links later in the presentation. So the path to net zero, where are we at currently? We track progress through a couple of different means. We have an annual progress report that focuses on the actions and the strategy. And then we have a sector-based emissions inventory that tells us where we are with our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. We've also completed one consumption-based emissions inventory. That's not the focus of this consultation, but I just putting it on here so you're aware of it. And consumption-based emissions are emissions that typically would be generated outside of the boundary of Toronto, but used products that are consumed by people within the city, for example. So supply chain emissions, for example. But our focus is primarily on the first two. And if we look at our greenhouse gas inventory, our GHGs come from three sectors. 56% of emissions community-wide from buildings, 35% from transportation, and 9% from waste. And I can dig into those a little bit on this slide. So of the buildings emissions, about 55% are residential buildings, 34% commercial and institutional, and 11% industrial. For transportation emissions, almost 70% are passenger vehicles, 16% commercial, 15% heavy vehicles, and a really small amount from other vehicles like Toronto ferries or aviation emissions, for example. Waste emissions are almost entirely from methane from landfill, with a small amount from wastewater. And just backing up to the buildings emissions, obviously most of these are from natural gas. So that's home heating and water heating. And for transportation, most of the emissions are from gasoline and diesel fuel. So where are we on the path to net zero? The baseline we use for our inventory is 1990, and back then we were just under 25 megatons. We are currently down to 14.5 megatons, which represents a 41% decrease from 1990. So you'll see, like on this graph, that we've been trending downward, which is good, and hit our low point in 2020, which you probably would understand was the first year of COVID with a lot of lockdowns. So real big decrease in transportation emissions in 2020. And you'll notice from this graph that in 2021, emissions increased again by about 4%. And the 2022 inventory will be out soon, and we anticipate that there may be another increase as there was in 2021. The reason why we're only looking at 2021 and soon to be 2022 data is because it takes 2 years to complete the inventory for a variety of reasons. It's very resource intensive, tons and tons of data points, and we also have to wait for emissions factors to be released by the federal government. So it typically takes a couple of years we're normally a couple of years behind in getting the inventory ready. The 2022 inventory should be, I believe it's going to be released in December, so pretty soon. So you'll see where we are vis-a-vis our targets. We met and exceeded our 2020 target, but you can tell that we are looking like we need to get back on that downward trajectory to meet the 2025 target of a 45% reduction in emissions, and definitely on a downward trajectory to meet the 2030 target of a 65% reduction in emissions. And I mentioned earlier, these interim targets are important, right? Because we can't just do it all in 2040. We can't just keep waiting and waiting and then all of a sudden do all this work, right at the last second. We need to be getting on that right pathway to get to net zero by 2040. So anyway, so that's where we are now. We can talk a bit more about that if you have questions, but we are consulting on the next action plan because, again, we know we need to get on that downward trajectory. We need to figure out ways to keep reducing emissions so we can meet our 2030 interim goal and be on the path to 2040. So this consultation plan was launched at the end of October. And as Nicole mentioned at the outset, there's a couple of different focus areas. Part of it is the weather, because we know this is important to people. So it's really difficult to talk about climate in Toronto now without, acknowledging the elephant in the room that our highways are flooding. There's heat waves that we never used to have, at least in terms of length and intensity. We do want to hear from people how this is impacting them. So that's the first part of the consultation you'll see if you look at the materials and you do the survey. And essentially we're asking, like, how is the hotter, wilder weather impacting you? And then the second part, of course, is the emissions piece. And so we're looking at the most important things that we can do to reduce emissions. So if we go back to our inventory, and I mentioned that 91% of our emissions come from buildings and transportation, then we are placing a pretty significant emphasis, obviously, on those two things in the consultation. So the three things that we've identified that are the most impactful that people can do is to, if they have control over their home heating, to try and fuel switch away from that and improve the energy efficiency of their building, and also to reduce their transportation emissions. So, for example, if you own a car, that would mean driving a different type of car, leaving your car at home more, taking transit, walking, cycling. And then for those who don't own their own home and maybe don't own a car, for example, there's still things that you can do. And we encourage people to talk about climate, to advocate, to talk to their landlord, talk to their neighbors, their family members, elected officials, anyone in their community, because we do know that this is a community-wide effort, and we want to make sure everyone has a role to play in this process and in the implementation of the strategy. So those are the three key focus areas of the consultation. Bit of background on this, like we've done 3 previous citywide consultations on TransformTO. So we do know, like, I mean, I feel like we have a pretty good idea of the actions that will go into the plan. Again, we know we need to focus on home heating. We know we need to focus on transportation. We're doing another round of technical modeling, and we've done quite a lot of internal engagement. We're always looking at best practices from other cities and municipalities as well. So all of these elements, along with what we'd like to learn from the consultation process, will go into drafting the next action plan. And basically, again, focusing on the key emission sources, we're sort of looking at 4 key questions. What are people currently doing on climate? What actions, what other actions or additional actions would they like to take? What barriers and challenges are they facing? And what supports could they use to overcome these barriers and challenges? Now, our consultants, Nicole and Stephanie, with the assistance of a local group, put together this video, and I hope this works. I'm going to play it, and it just shows the power of individual action. So just let me, hopefully the sound's going to work, but let me know if not. Just going to hit play here.
Everyone can help
You hear
Toronto
it?
meet our climate change goals.
Great.
Watch what happens when people mostly walk and bike instead of drive. This is a neighborhood where everyone drives. The red dots represent cars. On the right is a neighborhood where people walk up to 30 minutes or take their bicycle 1 day a week instead of driving. You can see that the neighborhood where everyone drives is covered in more red clouds, which represents greenhouse gas emissions, and the neighborhood where people walk or cycle has fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Help meet Toronto's climate change goals. Complete a quick survey at toronto.ca/net-zero-action-plan.
Okay, so I actually couldn't hear it, so that was a little bit weird for me, but I'm glad it worked for you. And you know, it's just again an example of individual action that people can take that we'd like to highlight through this process.
Everyone can help.
Whoops, let me get out of there. So you'll find all the consultation materials on the website. The URL is toronto.ca/net-zero-action-plan. And there are a few key ways to get involved. We have an online survey that we encourage you to take, where there's webinars, which I'm sure you're familiar with because we're on one right now. We're doing 2 of them. We have a group discussion guide that you can download from the website, and we're encouraging people to host group discussions. And a group discussion can be 2 people, it could be 200 people. It's whatever you like. It could be you with your family or your neighbors or your organization, your street. So if you're interested in speaking with others about it, please feel free to download the guide and have a discussion. And the way that the discussion information is submitted is also through the survey link. So when you get in the survey link, it'll ask you, are you completing the survey as an individual or as someone reporting on a group discussion? And we're also doing some pop-up events across the city throughout the month of November, and we'll also be doing some more in January as well. So you can find the schedule on the website, again, at Net Zero Action Plan. The consultation period is open until January 31st. This is just a quick snapshot of the timelines for developing the action plan. So on the top of this graphic, you'll see the internal work that we're doing, internal engagement and the technical modeling process. And on the bottom is external engagement. So we have ongoing engagement with the city's climate advisory group. They meet quarterly and also have some working groups. And so they will be quite actively involved in this process throughout the development of the plan. And then the public consultation process we're in the middle of right now. So in terms of timelines, we'll be drafting the plan in early 2025, so early next year, and it goes to the Infrastructure and Environment Committee and then to Toronto City Council in the second quarter next year, basically like in May, June. And that's it for me. So I'm going to hand it back over to Nicole. And I don't know, Nicole, if it makes sense to introduce our other staff members or not, but anyway, we can jump into some Q&A. And I have some questions on the slide as well here.
I don't see any oh, there, yeah. Perfect. So I'll read these maybe, and then we'll jump in. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I think are nice places to start. But if you have questions for the city, it's not just Andrew. We've also got Lindsay and Kim here from the Environment and Climate Division, and we have folks who work on specifically the new developments part of climate change at the city, Julia and Zach. So the first question, the second question I think is probably for you. And we have people that work on existing buildings also. Rianne is here, and Tamara on outreach. So we should have a good team of people. If you have questions for the city, it's a good time to ask. But also, if you don't have any questions and you just have, you want to share your experience, we've really just condensed it for the purposes of the webinar. Are the changes in weather impacting you? What are you doing to adapt? Is there anything that could help you adapt? Are there changes that you're making to reduce your emissions? What's motivating you to make those changes? And then what could help you make more changes? So I'm going to start with the questions in the chat, and then I'm going to go to Susan. Actually, I see your hand up there. Andrew, maybe bring the slides down, and then it's easier to take a look at people.
Well, sir, I can't find my cursor. Give me a sec. It's like not working.
Okay. So maybe just to start on the questions, Tomek asked a couple in the chat. So the first question came up right when you were talking about the emission reductions over time, the 41%. And the question was, where do the emissions reductions come from?
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at that, and I'll see if anyone wants to jump in. Like a lot of the emissions reductions you saw earlier in the decade were from the phase out of coal through the electrical grid. So we can't really take credit for that. That was the provincial government getting rid of coal-fired electricity, which cleaned our electrical grid. Now our grid is about 90% clean, if I think approximately. It sort of varies year over year. And the remaining 10% is natural gas. Some of the other reductions would be also through more fuel efficient vehicles, more energy efficient buildings, more energy efficient appliances. So yeah, I don't really have like a specific snapshot that I can show you, but I would say in the early 2000s, it was mostly getting rid of coal. And since then, it's been, again, incremental improvements in vehicle efficiency and building efficiency that we need to continue to build on. Anyone else from the city, feel free to jump in if I've missed anything.
Okay, good. And then I'll just jump to Lindsay, you good? Okay. So a big chunk of it was from the province, and then some from more fuel efficient vehicles, and then other spots. The other question was, and then I'll go to Susan, and then there's another question in the chat. So the next question was, why is it still legal to develop new buildings with natural gas heating?
Yeah, I can take that one. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, no problem. Introduce yourself.
Yes, for sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Zandona. I'm an acting program manager within the same unit as Andrew and team here, the Environment and Climate Division, and we specifically work on decarbonizing new developments. So we do a lot of work on the implementation of the Toronto Green Standard as it relates to energy and emissions. So just a bit of a background on the Toronto Green Standard. So it's our green development standards. There are a number of different requirements related to sustainability. What we are responsible for is the implementation of the energy emissions piece. So you ask why we still allow natural gas equipment to be installed in new buildings. Well, it's because we've been on this trajectory with the Toronto Green Standard for the past 15 years, where the end goal in 2030 is to require near zero developments that are coming through the site plan application stage. So every 4 years, the Toronto Green Standard gets more stringent. We are now in the fourth version of the Toronto Green Standard of 6. So come 2026, we will make another step towards near zero emissions and electrification. And then come 2030, we will be requiring all new development to move towards a near zero operational GHG emission requirement. So that means electrification of HVAC equipment and domestic hot water. We have been directed by council to accelerate those targets, and we are currently undertaking a study to assess all of our targets and how everything, like how feasible everything is in terms of our targets related to the Toronto Green Standard. So it's possible that those requirements get accelerated to 2028, but the latest would be 2030. And that's all just to say, like, the move from electrification or from natural gas equipment to electrification or electric HVAC equipment and domestic hot water is not something that could happen quickly given the price of electricity and the current state of the market. So that's why it's been a phased approach for the past 15 years.
Thank you, Zach. Excellent. Okay, Susan, thanks for your patience. And after Susan, I've got Campbell and then Grace, who've got questions in the chat.
So thank you so much. This has been a really excellent presentation and really informative. So you mentioned that none of this can happen in a vacuum, and I was just wondering what kind of cross-departmental collaboration is going on, if any, and if there's enough. And then I guess there's like kind of like the second part of that question is are the counselors being involved and educated, and is their office being used as a means to educate the public on some of these issues that may be ward specific, or because once we get to a certain point, we really need council to support as well. So.
Sure, thanks. Maybe I'll jump in on that, and I'll see if Lindsay might want to add something to what I'm saying. But for your first question, there's over 20 divisions, agencies, and corporations involved in the implementation of TransformTO, and you can probably guess some of the key ones: transportation services, city planning, the TTC, our corporate buildings people. So we do quite a lot of engagement through a variety of means. There's a senior leadership table at the city where the heads of all the divisions meet regularly to talk about TransformTO. And then at the staff level, so Lindsay and I and Kim and all of the staff on the call here, we do a lot of engagement with staff in other divisions. But ultimately, sort of where the rubber hits the road is that their actions in the action plan are attributed to them. So they're responsible for those actions. So that would be, so Zach was talking about the Toronto Green Standard. That's also a city planning action. So Zach's team works quite closely with city planning on the Toronto Green Standard. We work very closely with the TTC on targets to electrify the bus fleet, for example, and improve transit service to get more people out of cars. So if you take a look at the existing action plans, quite extensive, a lot of, and you'll see there's a column there that lists all of the other divisions that are either primarily responsible for the action or a supporting division. And so it's probably don't have time to explain that in proper detail, but you will see there that there's a lot of internal engagement on the actions. And then your second question was about, and I'll let someone else jump in if I missed anything, but your second question was on counselors. And that's a really good question, because counselors, they really connect with the public, obviously, right? They're a real strong means of for accountability for the city with people across the city. So for this particular consultation, we did send out materials to all 25 counselors, and I noticed in my local counselor it was in his weekly newsletter. So they do help us to get the word out. And each councillor also hosts 1 or 2 community environment days throughout the year where all of this information can be made available. And a number of the councillors are quite interested in this and have really regular contacts with management in our division. So I would say that, they're pretty regularly informed on this. And then the official way, though, that we do inform them is reporting through committee and council. So we report annually through the Infrastructure and Environment Committee, and then also to City Council on our progress report. And of course, this action plan will be going to committee and council as well. But I take your point in that there's an important role for councillors to help get the word out and to mobilize people as well. And I know many of them are really interested in that role as well. So I don't know, I'll see if anyone else wanted to jump in on that. I hope that's at least in part answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got 5 or 6 people, so quick question and quick answer. We'll make sure we get through more of them. So the next one is, how well understood is the impact of cars and natural gas heating on air quality? So you think about it more from a health perspective rather than a climate perspective. So is that something that the team has, sort of the health impacts of cars and natural gas heating on air quality?
Yeah, so we have I'm not going to be very good at answering this question, but we do have a GHG quantification unit, and we have folks who look at that in more detail. But I think it's also something that Toronto Public Health does. I believe they're a little bit more actively involved in monitoring air quality. I know, Lindsay, you used to work in TPH. Is there any info you might be able to share on that?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Yeah, my former role at Toronto Public Health. Yeah, so Toronto Public Health tries to make that link between, emissions in the environment and human health. I don't know the exact date, but if you go online, they do have a variety of publications related to air quality and health, and they've done calculations related to, premature mortality and vulnerable groups related to air quality. So it's definitely something that's on our radar and something that the city, through public health, does look at.
Okay, next one. The question relates to, and this came up last week too, the relationship between the city and the province. And the question is, how can TransformTO get involved in negotiating with the provincial government and our premier to promote active transportation and reduce car transportation? And in the chat, because that's where people are participating right now, there's somebody that's already replied and said, I disagree with that. That is a super normal thing in a public meeting. We all have different perspectives on it, but I think the question of just how the relationship between TransformTO, the city, and the province with respect to climate change, do you want to talk about that a little bit and how that works?
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit and again open it up, but we like our at the staff level, we don't really have much interaction at all with the province, right? So we're focused on municipal policy. So we work with transportation services, for example, on the implementation of bike lanes. It's an important part of the net zero strategy. But where the interaction with the province comes from, it's typically through the mayor's office or possibly through the city manager's office. So we would provide information for that process, like why are bikes important for climate? So we definitely support all of that dialogue with data, it's really important that we engage in data-driven decision making at the city, and we hope all levels of government obviously do that. So we've been asked by our senior leadership to provide information that then goes to council. Council can consider what we put in front of them, and I believe any engagement with the province would typically go through council or the mayor's office. I'm not sure if certainly that at the staff level it's not something we do. We do talk to other municipalities about best practices and jurisdictional scans and seeing what people are doing. But yeah, we're not really directly engaging with the province on transportation.
Okay, there's another one. Can we talk a bit about holistic approach? So, and maybe the extent to which the Environment and Climate Division is thinking holistically about this. So Tracy says, holistic would include, land use to improve carbon absorption. Is there something the city is doing, or what can residents do? Consumers are responsible for emissions in lots of sectors. Is there an opportunity to highlight that consumption is how consumption and just consumerism in general is contributing? And then, is there an opportunity to educate Torontonians on what other cities are doing? So those are, I guess my standard thing in a public meeting is that when you ask a question, most of the time it can also be framed as a piece of advice. My strong encouragement to people here is to also share your questions as advice. But Andrew, quickly, or anyone on the city team, on that holistic approach about carbon absorption around land use, promoting the point that consumerism contributes, finding out what other cities are doing, are those things that the Environment and Climate Division are working on?
Yeah, you will notice some of that in the net zero strategy. So there's a section on nature-based solutions, for example. So that's tree canopy, natural spaces, for example. We do have a green roof bylaw, which promotes water management as well, for example. So that's definitely an important part of the work that we do. We do find that when it comes to climate and emissions reductions, it's still a smaller part. We're really still focused on really reducing the emissions from those key sources I mentioned. But at the same time, nature-based solutions can have an important impact, and they also have significant co-benefits, right? So you're talking about shade from trees and green space for people, important public health impacts, cleaning the air, for example. So there's definitely a lot of value in that. You'll see some language. You'll see some language in the strategy on that. There's sort of a whole section on nature-based solutions. But in the action plan, I would say that it's kind of like a secondary action, I would say, just because it doesn't have the same emissions reduction potential as the actions that we're talking about with natural gas and gasoline and diesel. And I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the second part of the question.
It was just a holistic approach. The second part was
Right.
on like focusing on consumerism, for example, or educating Torontonians on what other cities are doing.
I
Yeah,
can jump in, Andrew, if that's helpful. Yeah, our division does have a circular economy team, and they look a lot at like exactly like you're talking about consumerism and reduce, reuse, recycle, those kinds of things. So that's something that our division through that team is looking at. The TransformTO strategy and the net zero strategy, while they are focused on mitigation, so the reduction of greenhouse gases, there is sort of space and consideration for that holistic evaluation, including, as Andrew already mentioned, the co-benefits piece. So the strategies to date have some elements of those in there, and we anticipate that the next iteration of our action plan will also include some of that.
Okay, cool. I've got Margaret and Tanya in the chat, and then I'm going to go to Karen. So Margaret's on what grants for home decarbonization are still available in Toronto? Have the grants from the federal government that Enbridge administered been restored?
I can jump in on that one. So
Great.
the grants and incentives that we were offering from the City of Toronto have been exhausted, but there are still incentives available through Enbridge. Again, they kind of come and go, but based on what I've seen, they did reinstate them or they came back in throughout the summer. But again, it's kind of ebbs and flows. They come out for a couple of years and then they go away and then they come back. So right now there are still some incentives out there.
I just got Tracy jumped in on the chat that she's on the Circular Economy Roadmap Advisory Committee, but there's no link back to emissions. So that's the part I think that they're going for. Okay, thank you, Rayanne. Next question. Is increasing local food security or resilience part of the planning the city is doing?
Yeah, the resilience is something that we have a newly established resilience team in our division, and you'll notice that in the consultation we are talking about weather and impacts. So resilience is definitely a focus. I might hand it over to Lindsay in a sec just to talk a little bit about how that might hopefully make its way into the action plan. And we did talk a little bit about food in the strategy as well. So food security is an important thing for people, especially as an affordability issue as well. So it's always something the city is certainly considering. Lindsay, could you talk a little bit about like how resilience and mitigation are coming together?
Yeah, absolutely. I can touch on that quickly. So, as Andrew mentioned with his public consultation, we're talking both about mitigation and resilience. And while net zero as a concept is a mitigation concept, we work very closely with our colleagues. We have a dedicated resilience team within our environment and climate division. They're doing a lot of really good and really important work, and there will be things that are released and published from their team, particularly in 2025. They will be reporting back, I believe, at the end of 2025 on resilience measures. But in the interim, because our report is going forward in June of next year, we are working closely with them to include both discussions about resilience and mitigation co-benefits, but also using the resilience data to really show the need, because the resilience data is what points to the strong need for climate action, as we saw in the images that were presented at the beginning of the presentation today.
All right, thank you. Karen, thanks for your patience. And then I've got Tomek up in the chat again to follow up on a previous point, which I think is important for folks to hear.
Okay,
Karen.
thank you. I think I'm talking to something that came out a few chats ago. I just left a meeting. I sometimes live in Manitoba, and Winnipeg is actually trying to get a report through a committee to actually, they want the report to see what it would take to get their buildings off of fossil fuels. And they're doing a campaign now to do that. But during this meeting, they mentioned 2 cities in Canada, Vancouver and Montreal, which seem to have policies of, eliminating fossil fuels from their cities over their period of time. And somebody cited a news story that came out this morning that it would not just be Montreal, but all of Quebec by 2040. And then I had a sort of side question here, because some of our buildings in Toronto, I used to work in one of them, are public schools. And they are huge emitters, and there isn't a lot the boards can do without the proper funding to retrofit their buildings. And so they go on being high emissions buildings. Well, this would require, I would think, some connection with the province, because they do the funding that, would help with this. And it would be a lot of money because some of the buildings are pretty old. And I just wondered how Toronto's going to manage to do this. There are a lot of these schools in the city. So I wonder how the city plans to connect with the province to reach that piece of zero emissions in the public schools. Plus, some of them are in strong need of air conditioning, but that's another story. Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Andrew, you want to jump in? I mean, this was also a theme that emerged last week, so you can go for it, or I could reflect it.
No, thanks, Karen. I was wondering, I might see if Ryan wants to weigh in on this in a second, but our division is working on some building emissions performance standards, which would be the mechanism to eventually phase out natural gas use in buildings. And of course, the Toronto Green Standard is already doing that. So we'll be focusing on new builds and existing builds. The existing piece is obviously a tougher nut to crack because of just the sheer number of them and the age of some, et cetera. And then I think, Ryan, I'll pass it over to you, but I think maybe TDSB may be part of Greenville Initiative, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so we do have a program at the city called the Greenville Initiative, where we've kind of gathered a large number of big building portfolio owners in the city and really created an environment where they can help each other learn on how to decarbonize their building portfolios. So TDSB, the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and another other large portfolio owners are all part of this, where we're really trying to create an environment where they can learn from each other, also providing training and resources to learn how to better operate their buildings and how they can maybe make some savings and gain some headway in that respect. There's often a lot of I guess I'll call them like beginner gains or low-hanging fruit just on how they're operating the buildings and learning how to do that better. That said, we also recognize that a lot of these buildings also have a lot of backlog from like a maintenance perspective, and you kind of went into that a little bit. So just kind of trying to understand how we can help them plan sort of like their capital plans on when to replace certain pieces of equipment and how to maybe make those choices of replacing perhaps a boiler with fuel efficient or carbon free heat pumps and stuff like that at the time of capital replacement, and not looking at like that like for like replacement, and just kind of really focusing on the education side of it that they can apply. So those incremental costs are a lot less because you do it over time rather than tackling like one building and making it completely net zero at a time. So hopefully that's helpful. And again, collaboration and working with other levels of government is always on our radar and places we're going to work.
All right, Tomek, you want to jump in, or do you want me to pick up what you've got on the chat here? All right, let me just jump in. I think it's useful.
Sorry,
it's just
I was
a follow
muted.
up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now I've got to switch back to the chat to see what I actually said. But I think the issue was that I sort of see a double standard in what I'm hearing today, because on the one hand, I hear speakers, and I forget who it was exactly, saying individuals should decarbonize their homes by installing heat pumps, also changing their habits regards to transportation. But then when we ask about banning the installation of new gas hookups, it's said that it's expensive. So basically, developers and industry aren't being held to the same standards as individuals. And not only is this a double standard, but this is a huge lost opportunity, because the easiest gains are the ones that basically don't occur.
Thank you. I think as a piece, do you guys want to talk about how you think about the relationship between the volume of contribution that individuals make and the volume of the contribution that the industrial, commercial, institutional sectors make, and then how you think about making sure it's fair between, or how you think about the relationship between who you ask who what to do and what the cost might be?
But
Or
I
if you
think
don't,
also
yeah, go
also
ahead.
new condos are a great example too, right? Like, so it's not just commercial and industrial. I'm sort of saying across,
Across
all
everybody, all new development. Yep,
Yeah.
good call. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem.
Yeah, I might let both of our buildings teams win first in a second. But what I would say is that just keep in mind, like it is voluntary on both sides, right? So we are not we're not mandating that anyone installs a heat pump, for example, right? We are trying to move in that direction. So, for example, if someone is doing a home reno as basically like a state of good repair, and they're going to put in a new furnace, that would be the time to consider doing a heat pump. But there's no requirement to do that, in the same way that there's no requirement for a large building owner. But I take your point that, we do need everyone, and the materials talk a little bit about this, right? This is a whole community effort. So we need everyone, to be playing their part. So really important for large building owners as well. If you look at our buildings donut, it's 55%, residential, and then, obviously a lot of commercial and industrial emissions as well. So really important for all sectors to be doing this. Zach or Julia, I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about like the sort of phase-in approach, and why basically it's the sort of fair way to do it with developers and building owners.
Yeah, yeah. From a new buildings perspective, I can just say that we're going to be requiring new buildings to electrify way before we ever require residents to electrify their homes. So I think hopefully that answers your question. And again, that will happen either in 2030 or 2028 for all the applications going through the site plan application process of city planning's process. And yeah, just to reiterate, like these things can happen in short order, especially due to capacity constraints. We've been working with the ISO and Toronto Hydro to make sure that when we do electrify, when we do require new buildings to electrify, that there is enough capacity. And that's something we've been working on, and something that will be addressed as we move towards 2028 and 2030. And so that's one of the other main reasons as to why, the switch to electrification and banning of natural gas connections just can't happen with the snap of a finger.
Thank you. Thanks to you guys. I like to close the loop on stuff like that. I've got 5:01. We were going to be an hour. So for all of you who are keen to learn more or share your thoughts, we would love it if you went to the website, the TransformTO Net Zero Action Plan website. And there are lots of other materials there as well. And the presentation will be online there shortly. So I think that covers the ground we wanted to. Questions super insightful, as always. Putting your finger on the disconnect between what we're trying to achieve and what happens in other orders of government or other area divisions. Oh yeah, thanks, Kim, putting the link into the chat. So you can go right through there if you want to complete the survey online. And I'll leave the last word to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining, taking time out of your busy days to spend a bit of time with us and listen, and also ask some great questions. We do hope you're able to do a survey and would consider having a discussion. This feedback's really helpful. Obviously, we took a lot of notes, and so we'll bring everything we heard back from this discussion. And again, if you have additional comments, please pop them into your survey, or you can also email us at transform@toronto.ca. So just again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we hope you can stay involved and engaged in this, because again, it will take a community-wide effort, and we really do appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks. Have a good night.